From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Many of you have no doubt heard of the importance of fallen leaf material for overwintering insects like bumblebees, and I thought with most of the leaves having fallen except for some oak trees here in Western Oregon, it was a great time to catch up with Rich Hatfield from the Xerces Society of Invertebrate Conservation to talk about a new initiative called QueenQuest. Now, QueenQuest is this citizen science initiative where you can go out to a little plot, maybe where there's some fallen leaves or some loose soil, and look for wintering bumblebee queens. We know virtually nothing, as you're going to hear in this episode, about wintering bumblebees. And so here's your chance to contribute to the science. And I just want to let you know, Black Friday, November 29th, there's going to be a big QueenQuest Blitz. So listen to this episode and you'll get lots of details on how you can participate. Rich is also going to give us a catch-up on a couple things. He was recently at this huge bumblebee conference held in Toronto, Bombus 2.0, and he's also going to give us an update on the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas. Remember last year about this time we had a first-year update. We're going to get a second-year update in this episode. And just to conclude, I want to remind you again, there's the 2019 Orchard Bee Association annual meeting coming up. It's going to be in Riverside, California, December 13th and 14th. If you're in Southern California or somewhere close by, you should check it out, orchardbee.org to register. Hope you enjoy the episode. Okay, I'm excited to be here at the Xerces Society office in Portland, Oregon with Rich Hatfield. Welcome to Pollination again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's great to be here.
We were talking before the interview, and you've just come back from Bombus 2.0, this meeting that took place in...
It was in Toronto.
In lovely Toronto.
Yeah, York University, yeah.
Tell us how the meeting went.
It was spectacular. You know, it was really, there was scientists there from all over the world, really, including South America and Europe, and obviously all over North America and Mesoamerica as well. And yeah, it was hosted at York University. Sheila Kola was really the main host, and Wildlife Preservation Canada also sort of co-hosted it with them. And they just did a fantastic job. It was a great program, lots of great presentations, lots of great conversations. There was a lot of conservation focus, but also, got down into physiology and all of the interesting things that are going on with bumblebees. The acronym BOMBUS, B-O-M-B-U-S-S, stands for, let's see if I can go over this on the spot. Building our science by using sound science.
Wow.
Building our methods by using sound science.
Really?
So that's what the acronym stands for. It was started, the first one was hosted at Utah State University by Jamie Strange. Mm-hmm. And so this was the second one 2 years later. And at the end of the meeting, actually, Remy Van Dam, who is at EcoSur down in Mexico, offered to host the third one. So in 2 years, Bombus 3.0 hopefully will take place in the state of Chiapas in southern Mexico.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so that'll be great. But there was, a whole range of presentations that went on. We did an IUCN update.
Remind the listeners what IUCN is.
Oh yeah, sorry. So the IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And probably close to a decade ago now, my colleagues Serena Jepson and Paul Williams, and I probably shouldn't have started saying names because there's probably too many people to acknowledge that I won't. I'll just say there's a lot involved in forming the bumblebee specialist group. And the goal there is to assess the extinction risk of all bumblebees in the world. And we've made quite a bit of progress in the New World, in the Americas, and we're a little bit behind in the Old World. But we sort of did an update and gathered new information to reassess the North American and Mesoamerican species at the meeting, which was great. And then there was a meeting on sort of I'm looking at tracking bumblebees like in the landscape, and looking at how to measure diseases. I mean, it was this whole, it's hard to sum up in a couple of minutes, but it was a really great meeting, lots of great participation, and exciting sort of cutting edge science in the bumblebee world.
Well, it must be so great not being lumped together with all the other native bees, because bumblebees are distinct. But also just being able to get together with all your colleagues around the world that are thinking about these same questions as you are here in the Pacific Northwest and in the U.S.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, that's right. You often go to like NSOC or something like that, and you end up with the bumblebee people, or whatever. And this was just all bumblebee people. And so, the side conversations were great. The networking was great. And it's just great to have FaceTime with people that you often communicate with all over the world. In fact, shockingly enough, so I've been working with Sheila Kola for 8 or 9 years now, and we'd never met in person before. No. Yeah, so we got to meet in person, and we also found out at the meeting that Leif Richardson, who's a postdoc at UVM at the University of Vermont, and Paul Williams, who's at the Natural History Museum in London, they'd also never met, and they wrote Bumblebees of North America together, right? So they wrote this book together, but they'd never actually met each other in person. So it was, really, just to a personal level as well as a professional and a developmental level, it was a really great meeting.
Well, speaking of networking, you were talking earlier with me about an initiative that sort of was launched at Bombas 2.0. It sounds really exciting. Tell us a little bit about Queen Quest.
Yeah, I will. Just a little bit of background first, I guess. So one of the things that we talked about in the meeting was what we don't know about bumblebees, and it's really a lot. We're kind of, especially when you compare bumblebees to like mammals or whatever, when you look at conserving them, like at this point, we can't even begin to do what you would consider like a population viability analysis, which is a pretty baseline thing to do in conservation biology. It's this principle that you can sort of look at the life cycle of an animal and find out sort of where the pinch points are. Like, where is the animal struggling? Why aren't they thriving? Is it when they're in the infant stage? Is it when they're in an egg? Or is it when they're an adult? And so we don't know enough about the bumblebee. We sort of know the basics of the bumblebee life cycle, but not enough about it to do these sort of in-depth investigations about what may be leading to the decline of some of these species. Does that make sense?
It could be, we always theorize, the queens didn't establish, or the colonies collapsed, but that we don't, it's a black box.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so when we don't have that information as a conservation biologist, it's hard to conservation actions. Someone said at the meeting, I think it was Elizabeth Crone, said it's quite possible that by just putting flowers out in the landscape, that we may not even be reversing declines. We may just be slowing them down some, and so just putting flowers out may not be the answer, which is true. Like, if the pinch point isn't the availability of flowers, the pinch point is the availability of nesting sites or the availability of overwintering sites, we should be focusing there instead of just putting flowers on the ground. But we don't know that basic biology about almost any species of bumblebees. And so I was in a meeting with John Mola, who's now a postdoc at USGS, and we just came up with this kind of harebrained idea to just get a bunch of people to go out on a day and go look. And just kind of as a joke, we were like, let's do it, And of course, we sort of announced it in front of the group as a joke. But afterwards, Sam Droege, who also works for the USGS, said, you guys should do this. And so it was at the dinner of the last night at which Sydney Cameron gave a really fantastic sort of keynote talk. Afterwards, we were just all getting together and getting excited and throwing names around. We were going to call it all these different things. And so Queen Quest was the name that we came up with. And so that night, I think on my phone, I bought the URL queenquest.org. And we were like, we're going to do this. And of course, I got home back to the U.S. and of course, someone had already used the name for something else. But it's a colleague of mine. So Doug Golik's at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and he has this thing called Bumble Boosters, and they started a Queen Quest last year. That was actually, or a couple years ago, that was actually looking for trying to track the emergence of queens across North America. Not queens overwintering, but the emergence of queens. So anyway, I contacted him and I said, hey, we've got this idea. We'd love to use Queen Quest. Do you want to join the team? And he was like, yeah, let's do it. So there we had our team. It's Leif Richardson at UVM, me at Xerces, John Mola at USGS, and Sam Drogi at USGS, and Doug Golik at UNL. And so, yeah, we built a website and put together a protocol, and we announced it just kind of low-key on Twitter, using a lot of the attendees at Bombas to sort of amplify the message. And the response has been great. We've got I think 30 or 40 teams have signed up across North America to go out and look for overwintering queens. And
I want to do this now. So how do I do this?
Yeah. You can do it by yourself. We are encouraging people to form teams, just because honestly, the chances of you actually finding one of these are probably pretty slim. And so, getting a group together to go out in the cold or the wet, and just go out, and basically we're asking people to sort of keep track of how much area they're looking for, but you're basically going to just be raking through maybe the top 3 to 5 centimeters of dirt or leaf litter or whatever it happens to be where you choose to look, and basically slowly go through this material and look for overwintering queens. And then we want to document sort of what species we're finding, what kind of materials we're finding them in, and then what sort of the surrounding habitat is like. Are you in a forest? Are you on the edge? Are you on a north-facing slope? Are you on a west-facing slope? These sort of gross things. Like I said, we just don't know that much about where queens overwinter, and it's how they spend half their life, right? So we don't know like half of their life cycle, basically.
And it's mysterious. You talk to bumblebee researchers in these hibernacula,
yeah,
like mysterious. There's like a lore around.
Yeah,
like
everybody has a theory about what it is, and but we don't actually have data to back a lot of that up. So much of our knowledge of these things are like papers that were published in the 1950s about what somebody observed, right? And that's all we know. And so there's a lot to learn out there. And so there's some guidance on the website about like a lot of these anecdotal reports that you and I are just talking about. We've sort of listed those and compiled those to sort of where might be a good place to look, but we also don't want to limit people to just those areas, because it could be there somewhere else that we just haven't even looked.
Okay, so the website, we will have it on the show notes, but it's
queenquest.org. There's a place where you can sign up. There's the protocol is listed there. There's a frequently asked questions portion there, and then the data submittal portal is also there.
And so just so people, I'm back at the lab, I'm cleaning out osmia, and so those bees are asleep.
Yeah.
A bumblebee queen is not. When you uncover her, what is she like? Is she awake? Is she kind of like...
She will probably not be awake at first, but there's a pretty good chance that you will wake her up in this process. And so, we're encouraging people to re-bury them. And that's why we want people to go through really slowly, is if you do find one, we want to try to not disturb them if we can. But
so queens, just in terms of just basic biology, from what we know, queens don't go into a very deep...
That's right.
Cessation period.
That's right. Yeah. They're in like a state of torpor, so their body sort of shuts down, and again, not that much is known about it. But they're not that deep asleep. They will probably wake up.
Okay.
If it's warm enough and other conditions are appropriate.
I'm so glad that it just goes to show these kinds of opportunities for people getting together. Generate some really great ideas.
Yeah, that's right.
Great people get together who think about these things all the time. You sort of make connections and.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that spurred this is this idea that like so much of the research that is conducted in all forms of biology a lot of it happens by graduate students or early career professionals. And so there's because the culture, and we don't need to get into this, but because the culture is to publish papers, and that's how success is measured. Like, a lot of these studies are set, you want to have a positive result as your study, right? You want to develop a study and run a project that's going to find a lot of positives so that you can publish that. It's harder to publish like, I didn't find anything here. And so like, it's unlikely that a graduate student might take on a project like this because the chances of success are so low. And so, just getting a bunch of people together to just do this and using the power of community scientists really makes a lot of sense. We can spread out across North America and cover a lot of ground, and we're likely to get a lot of zeros, right? A lot of people are likely to be, I went and looked and I didn't find anything, but that information is so important. But unless there's a way to set it up and gather the information systematically, we're never going to gather it. So anyway.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick break, and I want to come back and talk about another initiative that Xerces is heading up around that uses volunteers.
That sounds great.
To gather data, the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas.
Okay, sounds great.
Okay, we're back. Okay, so Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas has been going for 2 years.
Yeah.
Just for listeners who if you're in the region, it's hard. I'm sure you've heard of it, but just give us a brief outline of what the project's about.
Yeah. Well, again, it goes back to this idea that we're sort of lacking basic information about these animals. So we know about how many species are around in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, but we don't really know specifics about what habitats are important or what host plants they're using. And here at Xerces, we get requests all the time to help people, whether it's in their backyard or the 10,000 acres that they manage for the Forest Service. They want to manage habitat for pollinators, for bumblebees, because we know that some of them are in trouble. And I, as a practitioner, want to be able to give people evidence-based recommendations. And the evidence that I have right now, while it's pretty good, I know that it could be better. Mm-hmm. And also, as a conservation biologist, I told you earlier that we're trying to track populations of bumblebees to see what their extinction risk is, to see how they're doing. Are populations increasing or decreasing? And with insects, we just have, honestly, we have very little idea. We have to speculate oftentimes. And so we came up with this idea with a bunch of different partners, including, the Oregon Bee Project, the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, to take those 3 states, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and divide them up into equal area grid cells. And then we wanted to recruit community scientists or volunteers to go out and conduct these effort-based surveys so that we can get information about what species are living where, what the habitats are like, and how many of them that we find out there. And so we did this, launched it last year. I think there's close to 500 grid cells in those 3 states, and we've asked people to adopt a grid cell and go out and sample these areas. So that's sort of the general idea of the project.
And just connecting back with what you were talking about earlier, the reason that this kind of survey approach of gridding the state out and having a set protocol is so important is, you were talking about trying to figure out which bumblebees are in trouble, that you really do need this data that's done in a very systematic way. Yeah,
that's right. So for my work with the IUCN, which we talked about earlier, we had to go back and find out where species once lived and try to gather plant association information. And we had to do that because that's the best available data out there, right? That's how we know where these animals live, is because people collected them and put them on pins in a museum. And what a treasure trove of information going back hundreds of years. So thank goodness people were doing that. But all of those data were not collected for the purpose of assessing the the information we're using for it now.
no
Like
idea
we have no idea.
why
Like
they
yeah.
collected, how long they collected,
What they were doing, what their goals were, whether they were just trying to find rare things, or we often have no idea what the goals were. So yeah, having these systematic surveys gives us a really clear baseline of a snapshot in time of where things are now, with an idea of how much effort and what kind of survey methods went into it, so that we can track that. And in the future, we can repeat this or a similar survey and see what things look like. Have things changed? Are we finding species in areas where they weren't once, never found them? Are there many more of this species or many less of them? We'll actually be able to know that moving into the future with these effort-based systematic surveys.
And it's really exciting that this started in the Pacific Northwest. Like, this is probably a model that other states are looking at, but we had the great fortune of it starting here. Tell us a little bit about how we're only 2 years into it. Tell us a little bit about how year 2 compared to year 1. We had a previous episode for listeners to go back to hear year 1, but how was standing up a brand new program into the second year? What was that like?
Yeah, I guess before we do that, I just want to take one step back and acknowledge that so Vermont did the first sort of community science-based atlas that was run by the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and I don't want to pretend that this is me.
Vermont part of Canada?
Okay. Yeah, and then the Maine has launched a similar program, and then Elaine Evans in Minnesota has been doing some of this as well. So yeah.
My first one in the West.
There you go. That's, I think we can, first one west of the Rockies, okay. For sure. But I want, because I learned a lot from them, so I just want to acknowledge them up front if I can do that.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for doing that.
Yeah. And if I left anybody out, I think Doug Golick also in Nebraska did an effort. Bumble Boosters was also a community science-based.
That's someone we have to have on the show. He's been doing a lot of stuff in Nebraska, and I always hear about it, and it was that Queen Quest was associated with him as well. So it's like, I have to get him on the show. Yeah, you should. And we actually just partnered with him to launch a Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas, and 2019 was its first season, and I could probably share some anecdotal information, but Katie Lamke is a Xerces employee, and she's sort of spearheading that, but Doug is her sort of co-pilot and is running that project. So, okay, all right, so your second year was not, it was already built on the shoulders of other initiatives.
That's right.
Started here.
That's right.
But still, running a program for 2 years, you learned stuff in your second year from the first year. What was coming into the second year like, and tell us a little bit about year 2?
Well, I think one of the things that we learned in year 1 was that people love bumblebees. It was an easy sell for a lot of people. Like, we did a bunch of trainings all over the region in 2018.
I remember this year you went, even in Burns, you were really focusing on the east part of the state.
We were trying to, for Oregon, we were trying to focus, that was kind of the whole. But everywhere that we've led a workshop, they've sold out. Yeah. Like, we can't, I don't want to say we're knocking people away with a stick, but it's like it often feels like we're selling out a concert or something like that. A lot of these spots for these workshops are filling up very quickly, and it's created some demand. But thankfully, like, if people can't attend a workshop, we actually have resources available on the website, so people can get a training.
Oh, and they're very comprehensive.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
A lot of videos, a lot of
yep.
Everything is laid out really well, so even if you were to go to a training, you could pick it up.
That's right.
Yeah.
But as we mentioned, like before, just talking about Bombas, like being in the same room with a group of the same people, like that are on the same path, is powerful, right? Things happen in these in-person events that don't happen when you're at home watching a video on your computer, right? So there is something about being in the room. But if you can't make it, obviously, you can use the resources on the website, and we definitely encourage people to do that, to get involved. But yeah, so in 2018, we really learned that people love bumblebees, and we can create this network of people that are out there doing great things and collecting great information. And so yeah, we were really successful in 2018. We collected a ton of data, but we still had this problem of collecting most of our information in high population density centers, right? Mm-hmm. So like close to Portland and close to Seattle and close to Boise. Like those are the grid cells that filled up fastest, and we collected the most information. So 2019 was all about really sort of pushing people outside of those population centers, encouraging them to get out into the remote parts of our beautiful region and collect this information.
Okay.
And so yeah, we did almost all of our workshops this year were sort of east of the Cascade Crest. We did one in Spokane, we did one in Burns, and Idaho Falls. And so those were our goals, is sort of try to get people engaged in those more remote areas of the region.
Tell us a little bit about what they found.
Well, we were able to successfully do that. Like Washington is basically almost completely covered. So the whole state of Washington has been surveyed at this point, which is spectacular. There's still a little bit of sort of gaps to fill, and we'll get towards that as we move towards 2020, but Washington is really well covered. Idaho is quite well covered, except for this very southern portion of the state, which is very low population density and is sort of sage steppe, kind of really dry habitat. So there's kind of a gap there. And then southeastern Oregon is also a bit of a gap still. We're still struggling to get surveys out in that portion of.
When we're talking southeast Oregon, we're talking Harney and Malheur
counties. Yeah.
Those 2 counties.
Yeah.
They're big counties.
Yeah, they're big counties, and the area around Steens Mountain. And we did do a training in Burns, and we had, I think 30 people came to that training, which, that's a lot of people. So, we did get some surveys out there, but there's a lot of area that still needs to be surveyed. So.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about some of the findings from this year, how they compare with, we have more data.
Yeah, so we collected about 6,000 records in 2018. Mm-hmm. We got 6,000 bumblebee records. In 2019, we got 8,000 bumblebee records.
Wow.
Yeah, so about a 30% increase. So my eyes are going cross-eyed as I try to identify a lot of these, and better coverage. Yeah, so we've filled in a lot of the gaps, which is fantastic. And also another really exciting finding is we added in 2019 we added 2 species that we didn't have in 2018 as well.
Species of bumblebees that we didn't know we had in the region.
Well, I think we knew we had them in the region, but they weren't documented in the atlas. So they hadn't been documented in several years in the state.
Tell us about those bees.
So one of them is Bombus kirbyellis, which if you're following along at home in bumblebees of North America, it's actually listed as Bombus balteatus in that book. The name has since changed because of CO1 barcodes and whatever it is that Paul Williams is. I shouldn't say that. Paul Williams does fantastic work, and he has sort of reorganized the Alpinobombus, the subgenus Alpinobombus, and kirbyellis is separate from Bombus balteatus. So it's got a new name. But that species was found in far northern Washington, basically on the British Columbia border. At high elevation.
What's its known range? Where does it usually?
So it's mostly like
Rocky Mountain.
No, it's actually it's like a high tundra species, like in far northern Canada, Alaska. It's pretty common up there, in the Yukon. But it does follow down the spine of the Rockies. So like there are populations sort of down the spine of the Rockies, and then it sort of skips from basically the far northern Cascades, and then there's a population in the Sierra that we know about.
Really?
Yeah. And so, but now after finding it this summer, and I should say that I got photos from Don Rolfs, who's
great.
Don. Yeah. So he's the one who first found kirbyellis in this location in far northern Washington and told me about it. But I wanted to document it as part of survey in the atlas. So. Got back up there.
Okay, so that's the first one.
The second one is Bombus frigidus, which is another species just known from really high elevations, colder areas. So we documented both of those 2 species.
Both in Washington?
Both in Washington.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I was talking about kirbyellis, like So it exists in British Columbia pretty commonly, and then in the Sierra. So I'm now interested in like surveying these high volcano spots between sort of British Columbia and California to see if indeed, we find it like on Mount Hood and Mount Jefferson, and is it on these high elevation sort of skipping stones on the way down to the Sierra? So that's a question I have for 2020, and hopefully and do some more high elevation surveys. Like so many people have contributed to this work, and it's just great to see like so many people putting in the effort to gather this information. Super exciting.
If I remember last year, there were some surprising trends. I have to jog back to that conversation. I thought there was some bees that were western, maybe it was Vosensensky that was moving east.
Yeah, we got Vosensensky in Idaho last year, which is super cool. We didn't get it again, but it is still like pushing further east from what, like if you're following at home in Bumblebees of North America, like it seems that species runs further east than trends in that book. Like there's more records to the east, which is really neat. And this year, actually, I just identified a Bombus van Dijkii, which is a very similar species to Vosensensky, also from much further east than it had previously been recorded. So that species maybe has a bigger range than we thought from before as well.
One of the big, for this region, one of the focus foci were a number of bumblebees that we are concerned about, Occidentalis and Morrisoni. Tell us a little bit about what we've learned in 2019 about those bees.
Yeah, for Occidentalis, we seem to be filling in some gaps. So like east of the Cascade Sierra crest. Mm-hmm. And so for those of you that don't live in the region, like the Cascades run north to south about 60 miles inland from the Pacific Ocean. It's a rough guide as to what the Cascade Sierra crest is. So once the western bumblebee was sort of found throughout this region, but since the late 1990s, that species basically has disappeared west of the Cascade Sierra crest. There are some records on the Olympic Peninsula and a few records near Seattle, but for the most part, that species, which was once pretty common in this area, like the Portland area, has completely disappeared from here. And that still seems to be the case. We don't have any new records west of the Cascade Sierra crest, unfortunately. But east of the Cascade Sierra crest and west of the Rockies, like it's quite a few places. Like there are a lot of records of that species, which is encouraging. Like it may be, it's hard to know. Again, we don't have the baseline surveys to compare it to, but we're finding it in a lot of places. When we do find it, it seems to be like one or two individuals. So it's not at the sort of relative abundance that it probably once was, but we're finding it a lot of places, which is really exciting. And in 2019, we've found it in quite a few more locations than we did in 2018, partially because we have people out sampling in these undersampled areas.
I suppose that's the issue. One could interpret it as a recovery, but you never looked before, so it could be this is just where these populations have retreated to.
Exactly, and that's one of the problems I think with these sort of IUCN analyses that we have done, is that we sort of have, when we don't see a dot on a map, we sort of infer that it's not there. But the reality is that it could be that no one's ever looked, Yeah. And so those two things are very different. And so assuming absences by lack of points on a map is it's a big assumption to make. And, we're helping to fill in some of those gaps. And the cool thing is, especially with Occidentalis, there's a woman whose name is Tabitha Graves, who again is at the USGS. She's doing some occupancy modeling for Occidentalis to try to, because
I've heard that term before, but I don't understand what it is, occupancy modeling.
Well, it's basically this idea that you can use presence points to find areas where you're likely to find it if you go look for it, if that makes sense.
So it's kind of like you saw it there before, it's occupying that space, you see it again, and that the rate at which you don't see it again tells you something about
where else you might find it.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm not doing it justice, and I'm not an occupancy modeler, so if you should talk to Tabitha, you should have her on the podcast, because she'd be great. But anyways, so a lot of these data are going to go into that model, which is going to help inform, so the Fish and and Wildlife Service has been petitioned to list that species as endangered, the western bumblebee. And so these data that people are collecting right now are being plugged into Tabitha's model, which are going to help inform that process. So it's super cool that people are like really contributing to conservation science in a real, like, sort of concrete, measurable way, which is super neat, you know.
Another species that we are paying attention to is Morrison's on the east side. How did Morrison's?
You know, we didn't see nearly as many of that species this year as we did last year. So hard to say. Although we do have a record, and I haven't actually looked at the Bumblebees of Bumblebees in North America book since, but just yesterday I verified a record from South Central Oregon, like just east of the Cascade Crest, and like east of Ashland, basically on the other side of the Cascades from Ashland, and I have a suspicion that may be a fairly new location for that species, although there are a few records in Northern California, like a handful of spattering of them. But we'd never seen it there before in our studies, so that was a new location for that species.
I guess the last question I want to ask you is what's next for Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas? I think there's, in Oregon, the funding has run out, and you still have funding in other Pacific Northwest states. If we have Nebraska, tell us a little bit about what's on the horizon for.
Yeah. So after 2 years, you know, we've covered a lot of the 3-state area. We're committed to trying to finish Oregon, even though the funding has run out. So we're gonna sort of plow forward. We've gotten some assistance from the Forest Service and the BLM because they're super interested in these data as well. And so we've identified from the first 2 years of surveys, there are still areas that have not been well sampled. So we're going to really target and put out a map sometime in the next, I don't want to oversell something, but sometime in the next couple months, we're going to put a map out that says, hey, we need your help and we need you to go here. It's not going to be sort of a range-wide ask anymore, but really specific grid cells that we need people to go out to sort of finish in Oregon, Idaho, and Washington. So that's our hope, is we want to spend 2020 cleaning up and finishing up the complete atlas so that we can actually publish sort of statewide atlas and understanding of where we are in those 3 states. So that's really the goal, is clean up the great work that's been done. We've made tremendous progress, but there's still some areas that we have to finish, and we're going to need some help to do that.
I suppose the other question that people might have is, this sounds like something that should be done across the country. There should be some kind of survey of the state of bumblebees, given our concern about them and other bee genera. I know you and I have been
funding would help.
Funding is the issue. So just really there is no kind of federal funding for something like this yet.
As I understand it, there's currently no federal effort for monitoring. And, you know, I think, but there should be, right? And that's actually one of the big things that came up at the Bombas meeting, is that there's a need for not just a national, but an international monitoring network that's standardized. Like, so, you know, I'm totally at fault of this, but like I mentioned, there's efforts in Vermont and Maine and Minnesota and Wisconsin going on right now. And we all have similar but different methods, right? So like we can compare our results, but you know, it would be better if we were all just doing the same thing, if we established a nationwide monitoring network. But I think with the expertise and the tools that we've developed at this point, I think we could do it. I think the bar for setting up and allowing people to go out and do these standardized surveys, I think it's a reasonable ask. I think it's a reasonable goal. The pinch point right now is doing, you know, getting someone to look at the photos and to verify the bees that we're taking photos of. You know, I had to do close to 8,000 of them this year. Yeah, that's a lot of photos to look at. And, you know, if we were to expand it to 50 or 49 states, there's no bumblebees in Hawaii. Plus, you know, the Canadian territories and provinces, like we're going to get a lot more than that, and so finding the people that are funded, that can sit down in front of a computer and verify those photos is that's a pinch point right now. We don't have, I don't think I would personally, I'd have to sit for way too many hours to do the entire continent. So I would need a lot of help. And so one of the cool things actually that's also coming out of this is, so now we have this, I think at least, really great database in Bumblebee Watch of expert verified, at least I hope I'm an expert, verified photos that now there's a bunch of people that are interested in using our data set to actually use machine learning to train basically computer to at least do a first cut at these photos. That was another thing that came up at Bombas, is that would be really helpful. We also just need to train taxonomists, right? So a lot of funding, a lot of universities are cutting entomology programs, and we there are not that many bee taxonomists in the continent, as I'm sure you are very aware. And they're all getting older. So also that's another thing, is we need to train taxonomists.
Well, thank you for peering in the crystal ball and giving us a forecast and some of the paths forward. And also thank you so much for making time to update us on this really amazing initiative, 2 initiatives.
Yeah.
Seem to multiply every time I come down here.
Yeah. We didn't even really get to talk about the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas, which just started. So
give us a quick overview. How did it get started, and what's its charge? How? Yeah,
similar charge. So Nebraska actually has a really kind of amazing long history of doing bumblebee atlases. There have been systematic surveys that have done there. Yeah, I think LaBerge and Webb did one in the 50s or 60s.
Why on earth in Nebraska?
That's where they were, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So forestry people. They must.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so then, that was repeated again by the Bumble Boosters program with Doug Golick. And so this will be the 3rd effort, really. And so we'll be able to time series of data for all these different species. Cool. Yeah, and it's, Nebraska is also a very interesting, it's positioned kind of right in the middle of the country. And so it has some eastern species, it has some western species, and it's also just a very interesting state from a population density perspective. Almost all of the population is in the eastern 5th of the state, and then the western 4/5 of the state are just this diversity of sort of row crops, but also the sandhill regions, and then in the far western part of the state there's some really unique natural areas as well. So anyway, lots of sort of biologically interested and key biologically areas that we're interested in sampling and gathering more information from. And we just got launched. We got started kind of late this year, really started in July of 2018, but ran a couple of trainings and trained 60 or 70, maybe even 80 people in person, and ended up gathering close to 700 bumblebee records just in the last couple months. So
wow.
So
great.
And I think there's 60 grid cells or something like that in Nebraska, and we sampled in, I want to say 20 of them, so almost a third. We covered almost a third of the state just in that short period of time. So again, people love bumblebees, and I think 2019 is or 2020, is going to be a great year in Nebraska to finish gathering that information there. I feel lucky to be a part of it, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sinan-Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. First one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.